Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Dark and Precious Storytime. I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
In this podcast, we flex our creative muscles and maybe your patience by narrating original stories complete with totally professional sound effects. This will be the best 30 minutes of your life you'll never get back. Today's episode is called The Lake House, which serves as the setting for a tragic betrayal and then later a gruesome retribution. Ethan Cuddington was excited. His fabulously wealthy grandfather Herb was finally on his deathbed, and his estate would soon pass to Ethan. Herb Cuddington came from a long line of shipping magnates and textile barons, building on a vast empire that ensured a life of privilege for his children and grandchildren. Both of his parents and sister were dead, which meant Ethan was the sole heir to the Cuddington fortune. Ethan had never liked his parents or smarmy little sister that much. In fact, he'd never liked anyone. He'd heard people refer to him as a narcissist, but he didn't really understand or care what that was, as long as he got what he wanted. As Ethan walked down the hallway of the family mansion to his grandfather's bedroom, he composed his face into an appropriate mask of grief and sadness. Herb's bedroom had been converted into a hospice unit, complete with various medical equipment, IV stands, and a hospital bed, where the older man now reclined. A nurse stood nearby, filling out paperwork. The old man watched as Ethan entered and crossed the room to stand at his bedside. "Hi, Grandfather," Ethan said primly. "You asked for me?" Herb dismissed the nurse, who backed out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind her.
Clunk.
He stared intently at the younger man for so long that Ethan began to fidget uncomfortably. What?" Ethan asked. Herb took a long breath, and without breaking eye contact said, "You killed Sarah." A cold wave of fear crashed over Ethan, and his breath caught in his throat. "What? That's ridiculous," he stammered. The old man continued staring at him. "Oh, I've known all along. We all knew. We didn't say anything in order to protect the family name, but now there's no one left. Your father, your mother, rest their souls, are finally at peace. I'm on my way out, and you absolute horror of a human being, are all that's left of the Cuddington line." The grandfather looked away as a single tear tracked down his cheek. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to remember the day his little sister had died. Sure, he'd killed her, but he'd planned it so carefully. The family had always noticed him, but then Sarah came along and sucked up everyone's attention with her exhausting cheerfulness and ridiculous kindness. Everyone adored her so much they would fall over themselves to give her whatever she wanted.
Sarah's just so perfect.
Ethan still got stuff whenever he asked for it, but didn't feel like the most important person in the family anymore, and he hated that. And it didn't help that she was always trying to ingratiate herself with him. Sensing his distaste for her, Sarah worked hard to win his favor. She would follow him everywhere, begging him to play with her and giving him hugs whenever possible. Everyone always thought it was just so adorable how much Sarah loved her big brother, but Ethan just found her annoying. Sometimes, when nobody was looking, he'd give her a good pinch, or push her down, or break one of her toys, and then smile as he watched her face contort with pain or sadness. The best part was that she'd never tell anyone, hoping that would make him love her more. It didn't. Then, on her 6th birthday, Sarah got a pony.
Nay!
A frickin' pony!
Nay!
Ethan was insanely jealous. Although he'd never been interested in horses, it was a better gift than he'd ever gotten. That was when Ethan decided Sarah needed to be gone. He knew his parents wouldn't get rid of her, so he started planning. The next summer, Ethan, Sarah, and their parents were vacationing at the family's lake house in upstate Connecticut. The house was situated on a small bluff surrounded by trees. A boardwalk led from the house down a long set of stairs and opened directly onto a small private beach. Each day the family would walk down to the lake, where Ethan and Sarah would play in the water, while his father read a book and his mother lounged in the sun. Since Sarah couldn't swim, she would only go in as far as her waist, holding her pink inner tube around her waist. Ethan would largely ignore her, swimming out to the floating platform about 50 feet from the shore, where there was a diving board and a slide. One day, his mother and father walked back up the wooden stairs to the house together, instructing Ethan to keep an eye on his sister. Ethan saw his chance. Turning on the charm, he offered to help Sarah learn to swim. She eagerly accepted and held on to the pink tube as he swam to the platform with her in tow. He helped her out of the water and put the tube aside. On the platform, he began coaching her how to move her arms and legs, guiding her closer and closer to the platform's edge. He distracted her by forcing her to keep practicing while he surreptitiously cut a slit in her inner tube. Once most of the air was released, he glanced around to make sure nobody was looking, and then shoved her hard in the small of her back, sending her flying into the water.
Splunk.
He stood there watching the stairs for his parents while she flailed. Each time Sarah opened her mouth to cry for help, it filled with water, and after almost a minute, she weakened. Ethan saw her begin to sink and tossed the now deflated inner tube to her. She clawed desperately for it, and then looked at Ethan in horror as she simply pulled it under, realizing what he'd done. She continued staring at him even as she sank under the water for the last time. Ethan stood staring at the spot where Sarah had been. The water was fairly shallow, so he could still see the defunct inner tube swaying in the current below, wrapped around Sarah's arm. After another minute, he dove in to retrieve her body. He swam to shore and dragged her lifeless body onto the sand, faked some tears, and then started screaming for his parents.
Mom! Dad!
In the years that followed, nobody had ever blamed him outright for Sarah's death. In fact, most people gave him even more attention, praising him for trying to save her and consoling him as the grieving brother. This made him a lot happier, but he was always careful to express the proper amount of remorse or sadness, or whatever they seemed to expect of him, whenever talking about Sarah. However, once in a while, he would catch his parents looking at him oddly, kind of like the way his grandfather was looking at him now. "She was so good and kind. Why did you do it? Why did you kill that precious little girl?" Herb gritted his teeth in anger. Ethan frantically tried to think of a reaction that was appropriate for this situation. "Never mind," Herb continued. "It's done. I'm circling the drain, and you're just a vulture circling me." Then he smiled evilly and looked back at Ethan. "The only thing that matters to you is my money, so that's the only way I can avenge my granddaughter. You get nothing." He laid back, closing his eyes. "Get out, Ethan. In my mind, you stopped being a part of this family 20 years ago when you killed my little Sarah. You won't get a dime of my money, you murdering prick." Ethan was stunned at the pronouncement, and even more aghast at the prospect of losing his inheritance. He edged closer to the pillows piled on the chair next to the bed, but Herb just chuckled and held up the call button he'd just pressed. "Not going to be that easy to kill me, you son of a bitch," he murmured as the nurse walked in. A few weeks later, Herb Cuddington died. True to his word, he'd been protected by someone at all hours. Increasingly desperate, Ethan had even tried to gain access a couple of times, only to be rebuffed by a suspicious armed guard.
Get out of here.
Despite Herb's accusation, Ethan was never directly confronted about Sarah's death. Although relieved, he was furious he'd been denied his rightful inheritance. While waiting for the will to be executed, Ethan played to the media frenzy, depicting his grandfather as vindictive, senile, abusive, and anything else to curry favor with everyone following the debacle. Convinced he'd been written totally out of Cuddington's will, Ethan was surprised to learn he'd inherited one thing: the lake house in Connecticut where Sarah had died. Compared to the family mansion, the lake house was tiny, but since it was his only asset, he begrudgingly took up residence in the 8-bedroom house. Since his sister's death, the family had avoided the property, paying the bare minimum to keep the place from falling to ruin, but never revisiting the site of the tragedy. So when he began finding water puddles in his bedroom, Ethan assumed bare minimum didn't include the water pipes and called a local plumber, who spent half a day examining all the pipes and eventually declared them to be in perfect working order. But the next morning, Ethan awoke to the same 3-foot-wide puddle on the floor at the foot of his bed. He wrote off the plumber as a fool and slept in another bedroom, only to find the same puddle next to that bed in the morning. He called in a second plumber, then a third. By this time he was concerned because, in addition to the puddles, he'd started hearing noises. Sometimes it sounded like faint laughter. Other times it sounded like splashing.
Sploosh.
Then, one night, he was sitting in the living room watching TV when he heard footsteps creaking the wooden floorboards in the hallway, as if someone were walking towards him. He jumped up and ran to the vestibule, but didn't see anyone in the hall. However, there were a few small water puddles, and upon closer inspection, Ethan could see the outline of a footprint, which was pointed in the direction of the living room. He stared at the footprint for a long time, noticing how small it was, like that of a child. He shivered nervously, then ran to the kitchen for a roll of paper towels and began sopping up the water puddles. As he worked, he tried to ignore the slightly fishy smell of the water and focused on getting angry. Obviously, all the water pipes were leaking, and the plumbers were either incompetent or conspiring against him. If only the old bastard had left him some money, he'd be able to completely gut and renovate the house. But no, here he was, stuck with this miserable old house and practically penniless. And he was having to clean this up himself, like he was some common housewife instead of the last living Cuddington. He fumed as he finished cleaning up the hallway, and then went to the study at the back of the house. It was a large room lined on one side by bookshelves, with a bank of waist-high windows forming the two outer walls, serving up a view of the trees and the lake beyond. Sitting at the enormous mahogany desk, he poured 3 fingers of the expensive scotch kept in a sideboard and watched the sun set over the lake. One drink turned into many, and before he knew it, Ethan slipped into a liquor-induced doze and began to dream. In his dream, he was sitting in the same chair and staring out the same window when he saw a quick movement outside in the lower left of his vision. Turning his head, he shrieked and froze in fear as a face stared in at him. The pale visage was framed by wet, dark hair plastered to the skull and matted with mud. There were dark sockets where the eyes had been, and gray lips wrinkled back in a sneer to reveal jagged black teeth. The figure cackled, and he watched in horror as the face slid across the lower edge of the window from left to right. It kept looking at Ethan as it glided smoothly, as if it were floating, rather than bouncing up and down like it were walking. Ethan gasped as he realized it was heading to the back door. Just as he stood up, he heard a faint click, and the back door creaked open to bump softly against the wall.
Bump.
The door to the study was about 20 feet from the back door and opened into the same hallway. Ethan looked at the office door, knowing all he had to do was take a few steps to shut it, but he couldn't move. He heard squelching footsteps cross the threshold at the back of the house. The steps began to get louder and faster, as if whatever it was had started running down the hall towards his room. A horrible fishy smell permeated his nostrils, and his heart pounded harder.
Bump, 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 bump.
As the steps got closer, and he began to moan in the back of his throat. A black mass suddenly filled the doorway, and all he saw were grasping white fingers and a gaping maw before he started screaming.
Help me, Jesus!
He jolted awake, still screaming.
Ah!
The only thing in the room was the early morning sunlight that filtered in through the trees. He must have slept through the night. He sat for a moment panting and waiting for his heart to slow down, and then stood up and crossed to the door. He peeked out into the hallway, and his eyes widened when he saw the back door stood open, with several of those small, wet footprints leading directly towards him. The fishy smell was stronger than before, and he held his breath as he stomped down the hall and slammed the back door, throwing the deadbolt.
Stomp, slam, click!
Once again, he gathered up paper towels and quickly mopped up the water. Obviously, he kept telling himself, he was so stressed by the recent financial duress and the crappy old house that he was starting to see things. He would need to figure out some way to generate income so he could fix the house, or better yet, just ditch it and buy something bigger and better. However, as he mulled over ideas, his feet seemed to have a mind of their own, and he found himself opening the back door and walking down the steps to the small private beach. The beach was a few 100 feet long, but due to the years of neglect, trees and shrubs had reclaimed some parts of the waterfront area. The old platform was still there, but the slide and diving board were gone, probably pilfered at some point. Ethan stood looking at the platform as he dug his toes in the damp sand at the water's edge. As he gazed at the rotting boards of the platform, he heard a soft splashing sound from nearby,
Sploosh, sploosh.
as if someone was swimming around. He frowned at the thought of trespassers on his property and walked toward the sound. The splashing sounds grew louder.
Sploosh, sploosh.
As he ducked under a huge low tree branch that stretched out over the water, then pushed through some bushes and vines. But when he emerged from the undergrowth, all he saw was an empty stretch of beach with no sign of life. He was about to turn back when he saw a flash of color a few yards away. Curious, he walked over to see what it was. As he got nearer, he could see something pink, partially buried in the sand. Suddenly he knew what it was and stopped, whipping around in place, looking for evidence of anyone nearby. Satisfied he was alone and unwatched, he crouched down and pried up a section of pink plastic, pulling it with 2 fingers until he'd unearthed a pink inner tube that was faded and torn, just like Sarah's. He dropped it and smeared his hands on his pants in distaste. He quickly stood and walked back in the direction he'd come from, but paused again at a strange bubbling sound coming from the water, like someone blowing air through a straw. Ethan slowly turned to look in the direction of the noise, and his eyes widened when he saw a partially submerged head about 10 feet from the shore. Only the black eye sockets and forehead were visible above the waterline, but he knew it was the face from his dream. As he watched, a cloud of bubbles broke the surface, like it was breathing. "What do you want?" Ethan shrieked at it. "What do you want from me? Leave me alone! You're not real!" The thing in the water shifted, exposing the gaping mouth, and whispered. Despite the distance, Ethan could hear it clearly.
"Come back, Ethan. We need to finish our swimming lesson, remember?"
Ethan screamed again
Ah!
and turned, sprinting toward the bushes. He thought he heard the splashing again, as if it were coming out of the water, so he ran as fast as he could. He tore through the foliage, risking a glance backwards. It stood on the beach just a few feet behind him, and he was horrified to see it was wearing the same blue bathing suit his sister had worn, except this one was ripped and faded and laced with bits of mud and seaweed. It shuffled slowly after him, dragging the limp pink inner tube.
"Don't go, Ethan. You can still teach me to swim."
Ethan kept running, though he couldn't tear his eyes away from the thing that had once been his sister, which is why he ran full speed into the low-hanging branch of the tree he'd ducked under earlier. Light flashed as his head impacted the tree, and his feet shot out from under him. All the air in his lungs whooshed out as he slammed onto his back and blacked out momentarily. When he came to, his vision was blurred, and all he could see were flashing lights. As he gasped to get his wind back, he realized the fishy smell was stronger than ever, and he was moving. More specifically, he was being dragged. He looked down to see the creature had a hold of his ankle and was dragging him effortlessly toward the water, where the old platform bobbed as if it were anticipating the reunion. Ethan kicked at her hand and managed to free his foot, then began crab-walking backwards away until his back collided with the bottom stair leading up to the house. The thing turned to stare at him with those awful black eye sockets, and the mouth opened in a ghastly grin.
"You can't get away, Ethan. I've been waiting for you to come back and finish teaching me how to swim. You were always the best swimmer. You can show me."
Ethan stood up to grab the nearby handrail, but his head was still spinning, and the sudden movement caused him to stagger and collapse again. He felt those cold, dead fingers grab his ankle. This time it squeezed hard enough to crack his ankle, and he screamed in pain, kicking at the hand with his good foot. But no matter how hard he kicked it, it continued to drag him inexorably toward the water. As the cold water began to lap at first his feet, then hips, Ethan suddenly saw a shiny new pink inner tube on the sand nearby. How had he missed it? He lunged for it, hooking it through his arm and laughing in relief.
Woo!
He wouldn't go under as long as he had this. Now the water was up to his armpits as the creature walked further into the water, dragging him along the gravelly bottom. He lost his grip on the tube and gulped a lungful of air as the creature pulled him deeper and the water rushed up over his head. He continued to struggle, kicking and struggling to break the creature's steel grip on his ankle. As he began to see spots in front of his eyes, the grip relaxed and he kicked free again, pushing himself up to the surface where the bright pink tube floated cheerfully. He burst through the surface and grabbed the inner tube with both hands. He nestled his cheek on the firm plastic surface of the inner tube, sucking in air, then began kicking toward the shore. As hope dawned in his chest, he heard the creature speak from somewhere behind him, even though it was fully submerged.
That won't do you much good, Ethan. It didn't work for me.
The hand grabbed his ankle again and yanked him under. Ethan was amazed to see that instead of the bright pink lifesaver, he was holding on to the shredded, faded plastic he'd pulled out of the sand. The thing that had been his sister clambered up his sinking body like a monkey, gripping him tightly. He tried to kick toward the surface again, but as he struggled, he could feel her face inches from his, and despite himself, felt compelled to look at her. Even though they were in almost total darkness, he had no trouble seeing that the empty eye sockets had been filled with the huge, luminous, hate-filled eyes of his little sister, and when she opened her mouth, the teeth were bright and sharp. Oh, so sharp. Ethan Cuddington spent his last moments screaming in terror and pain as he plummeted into the inky depths and the last of his precious air floated to the surface.
The end.
The end. Okay, so I originally was going to call this story Creepy Kids, because kids are completely creepy, even though I have one, but they're still creepy. And they're the creepiest aspect of any horror movie in my mind.
That is true. Kids in horror movies are very creepy.
They're always kids. There's always the little girls, too, for whatever reason. Even if they're just, like, looking at you, you're like, oh my god, she's going to, like, do something super weird.
Right, because they always look so adorable, but you know there's just that little hint of evil there.
Right. But I think it's like that for any little girl, so.
He doesn't mean that, little girls. You're all delightful, and you're going to rule the world.
And probably giggle while they bathe in our blood, no doubt.
Why?
So, in this story, this was about a guy that, like, basically killed his sister and was going to, just figured that he would inherit all of the wealth. But why do you think that he ended up inheriting the lake house?
Well, obviously because the grandfather knew that he would be tormented by what he did in some way. Now, I thought it was really sad that you had him kill his little sister, because that just made me really sad. But he deserved what he got.
Okay, when you say I had him kill it, I'm not a mob boss here. The way the story played out, Ethan killed his sister, but the thing was, I guess the question is, did the granddad know about the sister's ghost?
Well, you wrote the story, so you tell us.
I don't know.
Was the ghost really of the sister, or was it the granddad's ghost making himself look like a creepy version of the little sister?
No. The granddad disguising himself as a creepy little girl?
Hey, you never know. Ghosts could maybe make themselves appear the way they want to appear.
I'm not going to say that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard, but...
Hey!
Okay, fine.
You can't say stupid on our podcast.
I just did. I can say stupid.
You can't.
Stupid.
Quit it. Nobody wants to hear any of this. I think we should start again.
No. I think this is comedy gold right here.
Uh-huh. I don't know about that.
All right. So you said that you thought the ghost might be the grandfather pretending to be the little girl.
Right, because that way he could ensure that Ethan would be tormented by a creepy version of his sister.
So it wouldn't be his little sister?
Well, maybe she's at peace somewhere. Although, I like the idea of her getting revenge, because he was really mean to her.
Well, Ethan's surely at peace, isn't he? And peace is at the bottom of the lake. So, my inspiration for the story came from there was a movie called Creepshow that came out back in the 80s. And it was like a collection of smaller stories that were written by famous horror writers of the time. I remember Stephen King had one in there. George Romero, I think, had one. Tobe Hooper had one. But one of the ones that I remembered had Leslie Nielsen and Ted Danson. And I think Ted Danson was cheating with Leslie Nielsen's wife. And so Leslie Nielsen, I guess, had caught him, takes him out to the beach and has him dig a hole and get down on his knees in the hole and then pull the sand in until he's buried up to his neck. And then Leslie Nielsen's like, okay, I don't want you to be alone while you die, so I'm going to bring you some company. So he somehow brings out a television with a VCR. Remember, this is the 80s. So on the screen, you can see that he'd done the same thing to his wife. And basically, because Ted Danson is buried up to his neck, when high tide comes in, of course, the water starts splashing over his head, and of course he drowns when the high tide comes in. But the last part of the little story is the two lovers, I guess, end up coming in and killing Leslie Nielsen. And they're all like, pale and got seaweed all over them and just a wet, nasty, mushy mess.
Okay.
It's really romantic.
Really romantic? Well, we love romance, don't we?
That's it.
And, this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to anybody living or dead is purely coincidental. Don't we have to have a disclaimer or something?
Right. No animals were harmed in the making of this podcast.
Okay. I don't even know what to say to that.
Okay, well, I think that's it for now. We'll probably wrap it up here, and then, we'll do our little sign-off. So, episode 4, the Lake House. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed our commentary, such as it is. Promise that the stories will get better and the commentaries will get better. So,
we hope.
But thank you for sticking with us this long. Until next time, I'm Dark.
And I'm Precious.
And we'll see you in the next episode of Dark and Precious Storytime.
Bye.
We hope you enjoyed listening to our story as much as we enjoyed telling it. We're pretty sure you have more friends than we do, so be sure to tell them all about us and click to follow our podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram at dark.n.precious or follow us on Facebook at Dark and Precious Storytime. Feel free to leave us any feedback or if you have any story suggestions. Who knows? You might just hear your story idea come to life in the next episode of Dark and Precious Storytime.